The tropical sun had barely crested the horizon over Port Moresby that morning, casting long shadows across the airfield where the modified bombers sat like predatory birds waiting to strike. Major Edward Larner stood beside his aircraft, one hand resting on the warm metal of the fuselage, the other holding a battered tin cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The date was March 3rd, 1943, and in the next few hours, everything the Japanese Navy believed about the safety of their convoy operations would be shattered into 1,000 pieces. The air was already thick with humidity, the kind that made your flight suit stick to your skin and turned every breath into an effort. Lana could hear the mechanics making their final checks, the clang of tools on metal, the sharp voices calling out clearances and confirmations. His B-25 Mitchell bomber, one of 12 that would fly this morning, had been transformed from a conventional medium bomber into something the Japanese had never encountered before. 8 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns jutted from the nose where the bombardier's position used to be. More guns lined the fuselage. The entire aircraft had been turned into a flying weapon that could pour devastating fire into a target while simultaneously delivering its bombs. Lana was a compact man, barrel-chested and broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that made other men step aside when he walked through a room. His service cap sat pushed back on his head at an angle that suggested he had more important things to worry about than military appearance regulations. His eyes, squinting against the morning sun, carried the particular hardness that comes from knowing you will shortly be asking men to fly into concentrated anti-aircraft fire at an altitude where a single hit means certain death. He had spent the last 2 months training his squadron for this moment. Every pilot had dropped 30 to 40 practice bombs on the wreck of an old British steamer that sat on a reef in Port Moresby Harbour. They had practiced diving to 200 feet, levelling out, accelerating to maximum speed, and releasing their bombs at precisely the right moment to make them skip across the water like flat stones on a pond. Some of the practice runs had been perfect, some had been disastrous. One crew had struck the wreck's mast and crashed, killing everyone aboard. The squadron had attended the funeral and then gone back to practicing the next day, because that was what you did in war. You buried your dead and you kept training, because the alternative was to fail when the moment came, and failure in combat meant more funerals. The intelligence briefing the previous evening had been detailed and specific. A Japanese convoy had departed Rabaul on the night of February 28th. Codebreakers working in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away had decrypted Japanese naval communications and discovered the convoy's destination, its route, and its composition. 8 transport ships carrying nearly 7,000 Japanese troops, protected by 8 destroyers and escorted by dozens of Zero fighters. The convoy was steaming toward Lae, New Guinea, where those troops would reinforce Japanese positions and make it that much harder for American and Australian ground forces to push the enemy back. Lana understood the mathematics of the situation with brutal clarity. Every Japanese soldier who reached New Guinea alive would have to be killed by Allied infantry in close combat, fighting through jungles and swamps where disease killed as efficiently as bullets. Every ship that reached port would unload weapons, ammunition, and supplies that would be used to kill American and Australian boys. The only way to prevent that was to sink the convoy at sea, and for the past year, conventional high-altitude bombing had proven spectacularly ineffective at hitting maneuvering ships. The problem was simple geometry and time. A bomb dropped from 10,000 feet took nearly a minute to fall. During that minute, a ship's captain could turn his vessel, present a smaller target, or steer between the falling bombs. American bombers had flown hundreds of sorties against Japanese shipping, creating impressive geysers of water, but scoring precious few actual hits. The Japanese had been resupplying their garrisons almost at will, and the strategic situation in New Guinea had been deteriorating as a result. Lieutenant General George Kenney, the commander of the 5th Air Force, had refused to accept that ships were invulnerable to air attack. Kenney was a fighter pilot from the First World War, a man who had spent his entire career thinking about how to make aviation more effective in combat. He had heard about skip bombing, a technique where bombs released at very low altitude would bounce across the water and strike ships at or below the waterline. A pilot named Major William Benn had used the technique successfully in night attacks at Rabaul back in October, but Ben had died in January when his B-17 disappeared over the jungle, taking his expertise with him. Kenny had decided that skip bombing was the answer, but it required modifications to aircraft, intensive training of crews, and leaders willing to take bombers into combat at altitudes where anti-aircraft fire would be murderously effective. He had found his leader in Edward Larner, who had listened to the concept, examined the modified aircraft, and announced that his boys were a cocky gang who would not miss their targets. Now it was time to prove whether that confidence was justified or merely bravado. The modification of the B-25s had been the work of Major Paul Gunn, a former naval aviator whose wife and children were trapped in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded. Gunn's personal hatred of the enemy had combined with his mechanical genius to produce what some called the commerce destroyer. Working in primitive maintenance facilities with limited tools and supplies, Gunn and his team had stripped the bombardier position from the nose of the Mitchell bombers and replaced it with 4 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. They had added more guns along the sides, eventually mounting 8 to 12 heavy machine guns that all fired forward in a cone of destruction. The guns served multiple purposes. They suppressed anti-aircraft fire by sweeping enemy decks clear of gunners. The heavy slugs from 50-caliber weapons could penetrate destroyer hulls, knock out gun positions, and create chaos aboard target vessels. More importantly, the nose guns allowed the pilot to aim the entire aircraft like a giant weapon. Instead of relying on a bombardier to calculate complex trajectories, the pilot could fly directly at the target and use a simple reference mark on his windscreen as a gun sight. When the mark aligned with the target ship, the co-pilot or bombardier released the bombs. The approach was brutally direct and demanded absolute precision, but it eliminated the variables that made high-altitude bombing so unreliable. The training had been relentless. Larner had driven his pilots hard, demanding perfection because he understood that anything less than perfect execution would result in aircraft being shot down and crews being killed. The wreck they practiced on sat in shallow water on Natiara Reef, where it had been slowly rusting since December 1923. For weeks, B-25 crews had made practice runs, diving to 200 feet, leveling out, accelerating to between 200 and 250 miles per hour, and releasing practice bombs toward the hulk. Each pilot learned to judge altitude and speed by instinct, to feel when the aircraft was at exactly the right position for bomb release. They learned that being 20 feet too high or 10 miles per hour too slow would cause bombs to sink instead of skip. They learned that releasing too early meant bombs would bounce over the target, while releasing too late meant the delayed fuses would detonate while the aircraft was still over the target, destroying bomber and crew. The practice bombs were painted bright colours so observers could track them as they skipped across the harbour. Some bounced perfectly, striking the wreck with satisfying thuds. Others sank immediately or bounced clear over the target. Gradually, through repetition and adjustment, the pilots learned the exact combination of altitude, speed, and release timing that produced consistent results. By late February, Larner's squadron was hitting the wreck regularly. He had reported to Kenny that they were ready. The Japanese convoy that had departed Rabaul believed it was safe. The route had been chosen to take advantage of weather patterns that would provide cloud cover. The departure time had been calculated to minimize exposure to Allied air patrols. The escort of 8 destroyers represented formidable protection, with experienced crews and heavy anti-aircraft armament. Dozens of Zero fighters would provide air cover. Every precaution had been taken, every contingency planned for. Japanese naval officers had considerable experience with American high-altitude bombing attacks and had developed effective evasion tactics. They had no reason to believe this convoy would be any different from dozens of others that had successfully reached their destinations. Allied codebreakers, working in secure facilities far from the front lines, had been reading Japanese naval communications for months. The convoy's departure, destination, route and composition had all been known in advance. Reconnaissance aircraft had located and tracked the ships from the moment they left Rabaul. On the afternoon of March 1st, a B-24 Liberator on patrol had spotted the convoy through a break in the clouds and radioed its exact coordinates and heading. At 5th Air Force Headquarters, that information had triggered a carefully prepared plan. Kenny had assembled his forces with deliberate care. Heavy B-17 Flying Fortresses would strike first from medium altitude, scattering the convoy and forcing ships into evasive maneuvers. Then the real attack would begin. Modified B-25s from the 91st Bombardment Squadron would come in at masthead height, their forward guns blazing, their bombs skipping across the water into enemy hulls. A 20 Havocs from the 89th Attack Squadron would follow. Australian Beaufighters armed with 20mm cannons and machine guns would strafe at wave-top level. P-38 Lightning fighters would provide top cover and engage any Japanese fighters that tried to interfere. The entire attack had been choreographed to create overwhelming violence that would saturate the convoy's defences and ensure maximum destruction. March 2nd had been frustrating. Weather had obscured the convoy through most of the day. B-17S sent to attack had found only clouds and empty ocean, but by evening the weather had begun to clear. On the morning of March 3rd, reconnaissance crews had relocated the convoy steaming through the Bismarck Sea toward New Guinea. The ships were approximately 50 miles southeast of Finschhafen, exactly where Allied planners had predicted they would be. Kenny had given the order for all units to attack. Lana had gathered his squadron commanders for final instructions. The briefing had been concise and direct. Different aircraft would attack from different altitudes simultaneously, dividing the convoy's defensive fire. B-17S would bomb from medium altitude. Beaufighters would strafe at wave-top level. The B-25s would come in behind the Beaufighters at 200 feet, using their forward guns to suppress anti-aircraft fire while delivering their bombs. The formation would attack in elements of 3 or 4 aircraft, with wingmen providing covering fire while lead planes concentrated on bombing. They would approach targets from the beam, parallel to the ship's length, maximizing the target profile and giving bombs the best angle for skipping into hulls. Timing was critical. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. Release bombs too early and they would bounce over the target. Too late and the aircraft would be directly over the ship when the delayed fuses detonated. The 5-second delay on the fuses was calculated to give aircraft just enough time to pass over the target and clear the blast radius. Pilots had practiced the timing hundreds of times, but practice over a stationary wreck was very different from actual combat against a maneuvering ship that was shooting back with every weapon it possessed. At 8:55 that morning, the call had come. The convoy had been positively identified and was within range. Lana had shouted to his squadron to mount up. Engines had roared to life across the airfield. Modified B-25s had begun taxiing toward the runway. Behind them, A-20 crews were preparing to follow. The plan called for all attacking aircraft to rendezvous over Cape Ward Hunt at 9:30 and strike the convoy at 10 o'clock. As Lana's B-25 lifted off the runway, he could see the coastline of New Guinea falling away behind him. The ocean spread out ahead, blue and apparently peaceful in the morning sun. Somewhere out there, Japanese ships were steaming toward their destination, unaware that every aspect of their mission had been compromised, that formations of American and Australian aircraft were already assembling to destroy them. The flight to the target area took less than an hour. At 10,000 feet, formation flying was smooth. Visibility was excellent. Lana could see the other elements of the strike force assembling around him. Heavy B-17s from the 43rd Bombardment Group were climbing to attack altitude. P-38 Lightning fighters were taking up positions as top cover. Australian Beaufighters had dropped to wave-top altitude, their twin engines leaving thin trails of exhaust. Everything was coming together with textbook precision. At 9:55, lead B-17 spotted the convoy. 16 Japanese ships were visible on the water below, their wakes drawing white lines across the blue Pacific. 8 large transports steamed in formation, surrounded by 8 destroyers that maneuvered to provide anti-aircraft coverage. It was a formidable force. Japanese captains, watching the skies above them, believed they were ready for whatever came. At precisely 10 o'clock, the first B-17s began their bomb runs. Flying at 7,000 feet, they released 1,000-pound bombs that fell toward the convoy in long arcs. The Japanese response was immediate and intense. Every ship opened fire simultaneously. The sky filled with black bursts of exploding shells. Tracers arced upward in streams of fire. Destroyer captains ordered emergency turns, presenting their narrowest profiles to the falling bombs. Transport captains steered hard, trying to position their ships between the falling weapons. One transport took a direct hit and began listing immediately. Another was struck and caught fire. But most of the high-altitude bombs missed, creating massive columns of water that drenched the ships but caused no damage. Japanese captains allowed themselves brief moments of satisfaction. This was conventional bombing. They had trained for this. They knew how to evade bombs dropped from altitude. Their defensive tactics were working. Then the Beaufighters arrived. 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters came in at masthead height, skimming the waves at over 300 miles per hour. Japanese gunners, who had been tracking high-altitude bombers, suddenly found themselves facing targets moving horizontally across their field of fire at tremendous speed. Before they could adjust their aim, the Beaufighters opened fire. 20mm cannon shells ripped through destroyer superstructures like paper. Machine gun bullets swept the decks of transport ships. The heavy cannons could penetrate armored positions. Sailors and soldiers crouched behind whatever cover they could find as shells exploded around them. The Beaufighters roared past, their cannon fire walking across ship after ship, creating chaos and suppressing anti-aircraft positions. Above the low-level carnage, Lana pushed his control column forward. His B-25 dropped out of formation, diving toward the ocean surface. Behind him, his wingmen followed. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 5,000 feet, 3,000, 1,000. The ocean rushed up toward them, growing from an abstract blue surface into a living, moving thing with waves and texture. At 200 feet, Lana leveled out and pushed his throttles to full power. The bomber accelerated to 225 miles per hour. The ocean's surface raced past just below his wheels, close enough that he could see individual whitecaps. His 3 wingmen spaced themselves out, each selecting different targets. Lana armed his forward guns, feeling the familiar vibration as hydraulic systems pressurized. Ahead, a Japanese destroyer was turning hard, trying to bring its anti-aircraft guns to bear. Lana could see sailors on deck scrambling to their positions. He could see the destroyer's bridge, the gun positions along the superstructure, the rising sun flag snapping in the wind. At 1,200 yards, he opened fire. 8 50-caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously. The noise was deafening even through the aircraft's soundproofing. Streams of tracers reached out toward the destroyer, converging on the ship's midpoint. The effect was devastating. The 50-caliber rounds, each as long as a man's hand and traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, tore through steel and flesh with equal ease. Japanese sailors on deck were cut down instantly. Gun positions exploded in showers of sparks as armor-piercing rounds penetrated steel plating. The destroyer's bridge windows shattered. Chaos erupted aboard the enemy vessel as gunners tried to return fire while being shredded by American machine guns. Some managed to get their weapons operating, sending streams of tracers toward the approaching bomber, but Lana held his course rock steady. The reference mark on his windscreen, a simple grease pencil line scratched into the plexiglass, aligned perfectly with the destroyer's waterline. His co-pilot was calling out ranges. 300 yards, 200 yards, 100 yards. At the precise calculated moment, Lana's bombardier released 2 500-pound bombs with 5-second delay fuses. The bombs dropped away from the aircraft and immediately struck the water. The specially designed delayed fuses prevented them from detonating on impact. Instead, physics took over. The bombs, traveling forward at over 200 miles per hour from the momentum imparted by the aircraft, hit the water at a shallow angle and bounced, skipping off the surface like stones thrown by giants. The first bomb struck the water, bounced once, and slammed into the destroyer's hull at the waterline with tremendous force. The second bomb followed, hitting the water and skipping directly underneath the vessel's keel. Lana pulled back hard on his control column. The B-25 roared upward, clearing the destroyer's mast with feet to spare. His waist gunners were firing continuously, raking the destroyer's deck as they passed overhead. 5 seconds after the bombs hit, while Lana's B-25 was a quarter-mile away and climbing, the delayed fuses detonated. Twin explosions ripped through the destroyer. The first bomb blew a massive hole in the hull at the waterline, below the armor belt where the ship was most vulnerable. Water rushed into the breach with tremendous force. The second bomb, exploding underneath the keel, broke the destroyer's back. The vessel's spine snapped, its structural integrity compromised beyond any hope of repair. The ship began settling immediately, its watertight compartments flooding faster than damage control crews could respond. Behind Lana, his wingmen were executing their own attacks with the precision that came from weeks of intensive training. Lieutenant Charles Howe selected a transport ship as his target, his nose guns clearing the deck of exposed personnel before his bombs skipped into the vessel's side. The transport shuddered from the double impact. Explosions erupted from cargo holds as the bombs detonated against munitions stored below decks. Captain John Hennebury, leading the second element, fired continuously as he approached another transport, his tracers walking across the ship's superstructure like a deadly hailstorm. One of Hennebury's bombs scored a direct hit amidships. The transport shuddered from the explosion, fire erupting from multiple locations as fuel and ammunition were set ablaze. Lieutenant John Smallwood attacked a different transport, putting 2 bombs into its hull and watching with grim satisfaction as the vessel began listing heavily to port. All around the convoy, B-25s were executing perfect attacks. The technique that had been tested in isolated night raids at Rabaul was now working flawlessly on a massive scale. The Japanese response was hampered by the sheer speed and violence of the assault. Anti-aircraft gunners found themselves engaging targets that were on top of them before they could properly aim. The 50 caliber suppression fire from the B-25s made it nearly suicidal to man exposed gun positions. Sailors who did try to fight back were cut down by streams of bullets before they could fire more than a few rounds. The skip bombs themselves were proving devastatingly effective. Unlike high-altitude bombs that could be evaded by maneuvering, these weapons came in so fast and so low that evasion was impossible. By the time a lookout spotted an incoming B-25, the bomber had already released its weapons. Captains watched helplessly as bombs skipped across the water directly toward their ships, striking hulls with tremendous force before the delayed fuses sent high explosives tearing through vital compartments below the waterline. Following the B-25s came 12 A-20 Havoc light bombers from the 89th Attack Squadron, also flying at masthead height. Major Glenn Clark led the first wave of 6 aircraft. As they approached the convoy, Clark could see explosions and fire from the B-25 attacks. Ships were burning, listing, or already going under. He selected a large freighter as his target and began his run. At 200 feet and 240 miles per hour, Clark fired his forward guns and released 2 bombs. The weapons skipped perfectly, striking the transport amidships and setting it ablaze. Clark's wing clipped the ship's radio mast as he pulled up and over, but his A-20 remained flyable. He circled and could see his target, later identified as Tai Mei Maru, burning fiercely from multiple hits. Other A-20 pilots attacked with equal success. Captain Ed Chudoba bombed the same freighter Clark had hit, ensuring its complete destruction. Captain Dixie Dunbar and Lieutenant Jack Taylor attacked Kenbo Maru, the smallest ship in the convoy. Their bombs struck home and the vessel began sinking immediately, its stern rising into the air as water flooded forward compartments. Above the low-level carnage, P-38 Lightning fighters engaged Japanese Zero fighters that had arrived to protect the convoy. The air battle was fierce but brief. American pilots, flying aircraft superior to the Japanese fighters in speed and firepower at altitude, shot down enemy planes with methodical efficiency. 3 P-38s were lost in the engagement, their pilots fighting to the end, but their sacrifice ensured that the bombers could continue their attacks without interference from enemy fighters. The Japanese fighters that did break through to attack the B-25s and A-20 found the bombers' defensive firepower formidable. Waist gunners and tail gunners on the American aircraft shot back fiercely. Several Japanese fighters went down to bomber defensive fire, their pilots discovering too late that these modified bombers were far more dangerous than conventional bombers they had engaged before. By 10:15, just 15 minutes after the attack had begun, all 8 transport ships had been hit multiple times. Most were sinking or ablaze. 3 of the 8 destroyers had been badly damaged or were already going under. The water of the Bismarck Sea was filled with debris, spreading oil slicks and Japanese sailors abandoning ship. Above the devastation, American and Australian aircrew could barely believe what they were witnessing. The technique they had practiced for weeks had exceeded all expectations. But the battle was not over. The Japanese were nothing if not tenacious, and the remaining destroyers continued fighting even as transport ships burned around them. That afternoon, Allied aircraft returned to complete the destruction. The second wave repeated the morning's devastating pattern. More B-17 bombers bombed from medium altitude, while B-25s executed precision low-altitude runs. By 3:36 in the afternoon, all 8 transport ships and 3 destroyers were at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The destroyer Tokitsukaze floated helplessly through the night, taking on water, and finally sank at sundown on March 4th. Only 4 destroyers managed to escape: Shikinami, Asagumo, Yukikaze, and Uranami. Even these vessels were damaged, their crews exhausted, their anti-aircraft ammunition nearly expended. They limped back to Rabaul carrying survivors, but having failed completely in their primary mission of protecting the convoy. The human cost of the battle was staggering. Of the 6,900 Japanese troops who had departed Rabaul bound for Leh, only about 1,200 made it ashore in New Guinea. Another 2,700 were rescued by destroyers and submarines and returned to Rabaul, but most had lost their weapons and equipment and would require weeks to refit and rearm before they could return to combat. Approximately 2,890 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed, either going down with their ships or drowning in the oil-slicked waters of the Bismarck Sea. For the Allies, the losses were remarkably light. 13 American and Australian aircrew were killed. 10 died in combat while 3 perished in an accident. 8 airmen were wounded. 4 aircraft were lost in combat: 1 B-17 and 3 P-38s. 1 B-25 and 1 Beaufighter crashed in accidents. Against 12 Japanese ships sunk and thousands of enemy troops killed, the exchange rate was almost unbelievable. The controversy came afterward, and it haunted some of the participants for the rest of their lives. On March 4th, Allied aircraft and PT boats patrolled the waters where the convoy had been destroyed, searching for survivors. The orders were brutal and unambiguous: strafe the lifeboats, machine gun the rafts, prevent Japanese soldiers from reaching shore where they could be rearmed and sent back into combat. The rationale was coldly logical. Every Japanese soldier who reached New Guinea would have to be killed by American or Australian infantry in brutal jungle fighting. Better to finish them in the water than to face them again on land where they would be armed, organized, and deadly. But the execution of the order was devastating to those who carried it out. Pilots reported sighting groups of 200 survivors on rafts and receiving orders to attack them until there were no survivors. PT boats machine-gunned Japanese in the water through the night. The justification offered by American commanders pointed to Japanese atrocities and tactical necessity. During the battle, Japanese Zero fighters had strafed American airmen who had bailed out of a damaged B-17, shooting them as they drifted down in their parachutes. Allied soldiers fighting in New Guinea had witnessed Japanese troops conducting bayonet practice on prisoners, engaging in cannibalism, and refusing to surrender even when facing certain death. The brutal reality of the Pacific War made mercy seem like a luxury neither side could afford. Yet for the aircrew who carried out the attacks on survivors, the mission was haunting. Some struggled with the memory for decades. They understood the military necessity. They had heard the stories of Japanese atrocities. But shooting helpless men in the water violated something fundamental in their understanding of warfare. General Douglas MacArthur called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial engagement of the war in the Southwest Pacific. His assessment was accurate. The battle proved that land-based aircraft could destroy naval convoys without the support of surface ships or carriers. It demonstrated that low-altitude bombing was not a desperate gamble, but a reliable tactic that could be practiced and perfected. Most importantly, it closed the sea routes to New Guinea. After witnessing the complete destruction of the Ley convoy, Japanese commanders made no further attempts to reinforce their New Guinea garrisons by ship. The isolation of Japanese forces on the island was complete, and their eventual defeat became inevitable. Without reinforcement and resupply, Japanese troops in New Guinea were slowly ground down by Allied attacks, disease, and starvation. The strategic initiative in the Southwest Pacific shifted permanently to the Allies. For Edward Larner, the architect and leader of the attacks, the victory was the high point of his military career. He had taken a technique that had been tested in isolated night raids and perfected it through relentless training, then led his men into combat with results that exceeded every expectation. His B-25 crews had scored 17 direct hits out of 37 bombs dropped, an accuracy rate that high-altitude bombing could never achieve. Kenny praised Larner and recommended him for promotion and decoration. The 90th Bombardment Squadron became legendary throughout the Pacific Theatre. Sadly, Larner did not survive to see the end of the war. On April 30th, 1943, less than 2 months after his triumph at the Bismarck Sea, he was killed in a flying accident. Coming in to land at Dobodura Airfield, he performed his trademark maneuver, diving toward the runway and pulling up sharply into a chandelle. The stunt had always been spectacular and slightly dangerous, but Larner had performed it dozens of times without incident. This time was different. His B-25 was heavily loaded with fuel, 8 passengers, baggage, tools, and 2,000 pounds of bombs. When he pulled back on the control column at the bottom of the dive, the overloaded bomber stalled. It went into a flat spin, crashed, and exploded on the ground. There were no survivors. Larner left behind a wife and 2 daughters. He was buried at Port Moresby with full military honours, his legend secured by the 15 minutes of combat that changed naval warfare forever. Captain John Hennebury, one of Larner's wingmen in the Bismarck Sea attack, took command of the 90th Squadron and led it through the rest of the war. The squadron continued using the techniques Larner had perfected, sinking dozens more Japanese ships throughout 1943 and 1944. The tactical innovations developed for the Battle of the Bismarck Sea spread throughout the Pacific Theatre and beyond. Other squadrons converted their B-25s into gunships, adding nose cannons and forward-firing machine guns. A-20 and B-26 units adopted low-altitude attacks as standard procedure for anti-shipping operations. The technique even spread to the Mediterranean theatre, where American bombers used it against German and Italian vessels. The psychological impact on Japanese naval forces was profound. Ship captains, who had once felt relatively safe when protected by destroyer escorts and fighter coverage, now understood that they were vulnerable to attacks they could not evade or defend against effectively. The convoy system that had sustained Japanese garrisons across the Pacific became untenable in areas where Allied land-based aircraft could operate. Japanese planners were forced to rely increasingly on submarines and fast destroyer runs conducted at night, accepting far lower cargo capacities and much higher risk. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea validated Lieutenant General Kenny's strategic vision. His insistence on modifying conventional bombers for unconventional missions, his willingness to embrace unorthodox tactics, and his ability to identify and promote aggressive leaders like Lana proved decisive. Kenny's approach became a model for air power employment in the Pacific. He demonstrated that innovation and adaptation could overcome numerical and geographical disadvantages. For the individual pilots and crew members who participated in the battle, the experience was transformative. They had trained for a mission that seemed nearly impossible. They had faced anti-aircraft fire at point-blank range. They had delivered bombs with split-second timing while flying at speeds that left no margin for error. And they had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The confidence gained from that success carried through the rest of their military service. Men who had doubted the tactics before the battle became its most fervent advocates afterward. Crews that had been skeptical about attacking warships at 200 feet became eager for more missions. The 90th Squadron developed an esprit de corps that made it one of the most effective units in the Pacific theater. The statistical analysis of the battle reveals the dramatic effectiveness of low-altitude attacks compared to conventional high-altitude tactics. The B-17 bombers, attacking from 5,000 to 7,000 feet, achieved approximately a 3% hit rate, consistent with peacetime practice but inadequate against maneuvering targets. The B-25s and A-20, using low-altitude techniques at 200 feet, achieved hit rates exceeding 50%, with some crews scoring direct hits with nearly every bomb dropped. The success of skip bombing depended on precise execution of multiple factors. Bombs had to be equipped with delayed fuses that would survive the initial impact with water without detonating. The fuse delay had to be long enough for the aircraft to escape the blast radius, but short enough that the weapon detonated against or near the target. Pilots learned through extensive practice that releasing bombs from exactly 200 feet at speeds between 200 and 250 miles per hour produced the most consistent results. Deviations of even 20 feet in altitude or 10 miles per hour in speed could cause bombs to sink immediately rather than skip, or to skip completely over the target. The precision required was extraordinary, achieved through hundreds of practice runs and the innate skill of experienced pilots who could gauge altitude and speed by instinct, developed through countless hours of flight time. The modified B-25s themselves represented a remarkable feat of field engineering. Major Paul Gunn and his maintenance crews performed modifications that North American Aviation, the manufacturer, had never imagined. The structural changes required to mount additional weapons. The electrical systems needed to fire multiple machine guns simultaneously. The ammunition storage solutions for thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition all had to be improvised with limited tools and resources in primitive field conditions. That these field modifications worked reliably under combat conditions testified to the ingenuity and dedication of the ground crews. Many of the maintenance personnel worked 18-hour days keeping the aircraft flyable. They scrounged parts from damaged planes. They fabricated brackets and mounts from scrap metal. They kept the B-25s in the air through determination and improvisation, often working through tropical rainstorms and oppressive heat to ensure that aircraft were ready for the next mission. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea also highlighted the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance in modern warfare. The Allied victory was possible only because codebreakers had revealed the convoy's route and destination days in advance. Reconnaissance aircraft had located and tracked the ships despite bad weather. Communication systems had coordinated attacks by multiple squadrons across vast distances. The integration of intelligence, reconnaissance, and strike capabilities demonstrated the evolution of warfare into an increasingly technological and information-dependent enterprise. The Japanese convoy failed not because its commanders were incompetent, but because every aspect of its mission had been compromised by superior Allied intelligence gathering and exploitation. In the broader context of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a turning point in the struggle for New Guinea. Japanese forces on the island, already under pressure from Australian and American ground forces, found themselves cut off from reinforcement and resupply. The garrison at Lae, which the destroyed convoy had been intended to reinforce, fell to Allied forces 6 months later in September 1943. The Japanese defensive perimeter contracted inexorably as island after island fell to American amphibious assaults supported by overwhelming air power. The air superiority that made these invasions possible was built on the foundation laid at the Bismarck Sea. The battle demonstrated that Allied forces could dominate not just the skies, but also the seas around contested territories through innovative use of land-based aviation. The human dimension of the battle deserves remembrance. Beyond the statistics of ships sunk and aircraft lost were individual stories of courage and sacrifice. The B-17 crew who bailed out only to be machine-gunned by Japanese fighters while dangling helplessly in their parachutes. The P-38 pilots who went down fighting to protect the bombers. The Japanese sailors who stayed at their posts firing anti-aircraft guns even as their ships disintegrated around them. War demands courage from all participants, and the Battle of the Bismarck Sea witnessed extraordinary courage on both sides. Modern military analysts studying the battle identify several key factors that contributed to Allied success. Tactical innovation driven by operational necessity solved the problem of hitting maneuvering ships. Realistic training prepared crews for actual combat conditions. Combined arms coordination used different aircraft types in complementary roles. Excellent intelligence provided targeting information and enabled mission planning. Technological adaptation modified standard aircraft for specialized roles. Each factor was necessary. Together they were sufficient for victory. Edward Lana's legacy extends far beyond his short life. His willingness to embrace an unconventional tactic and his skill in training men to execute it saved countless Allied lives. Every Japanese soldier who died in the Bismarck Sea was one less enemy that American or Australian infantry would face in the jungles of New Guinea. Every ship sunk represented one less cargo of weapons and ammunition that would kill Allied soldiers. The technique Lana perfected became standard for anti-shipping operations throughout the Pacific War. Thousands of Japanese vessels fell to low-altitude attacks over the following 2 years. The maritime supply lines that Japan needed to sustain its far-flung empire were systematically severed by aircraft flying at altitudes that conventional wisdom had considered suicidal. In reunions held decades later, veterans of the Bismarck Sea battle spoke of the mission with a mixture of pride and wonder. Pride in their accomplishment, wonder that they had survived. The 15 minutes of combat at masthead altitude, flying through walls of anti-aircraft fire, delivering bombs with split-second precision, had been the most intense experience of their lives. Many compared it to flying through hell itself. Yet they had emerged victorious, their tactics validated, their courage proven, their place in history secured. The principles validated at the Bismarck Sea remain relevant to contemporary military operations. Innovation can overcome conventional limitations. Realistic training prepares forces for actual combat. Integration of different capabilities